On a Tuesday morning in the late July of 2012, Emmett Dykstra stood at the edge of his lower pasture in Tama County, Iowa, and watched a county inspector drive away in a white pickup truck with a citation folded inside it that would cost him $430 and require him to remove, within 60 days, every beaver dam on his property or face additional fines of $200 per week. Emmett was 61 years old. He had farmed the same 380 acres his grandfather had broken from prairie sod in 1931, and he had watched Deer Creek run through the southeast corner of that land his entire life. He stood there in the July heat with the citation in his hand and the creek murmuring behind him, and he did not say anything for a long time. Let me tell you about Tama County in the summer of 2012, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what Emmett did and why it mattered. Tama County sits in the middle of Iowa like a page from a geography textbook. Flat in the north, gently rolling toward the south, cut through by the Iowa River and a dozen smaller tributaries that drain the black topsoil off 10,000 fields and carry it down to the Mississippi. The county had been farming corn and soybeans in continuous rotation for the better part of 60 years by then, and the creeks that ran through it had been managed accordingly. Tile drainage systems ran under nearly every field, pulling water off the land as fast as possible after every rain, pushing it into the ditches into the creeks into the rivers, and the rivers out of Iowa as quickly as the hydrology would allow. That was the system. That was how it worked. Nobody questioned it because it had been working, in the way that a machine works when you only measure one output and ignore everything else. Deer Creek was not a remarkable waterway by any standard a hydrologist would use. It ran about 4 miles through the southeastern corner of Tama County before joining the Iowa River, and it had been channelized, straightened, and deepened sometime in the 1960s as part of a county drainage improvement project. The channelization had done what it was designed to do. It moved water faster. It kept the fields from flooding after heavy rains. It was, by the measures that mattered to the County Drainage Board in 1964, a success. What it had also done, over the following 50 years, was strip the stream bed down to gravel and then to bedrock in some stretches, cut the channel 6 feet deeper than it had originally run, and reduce the amount of water flowing through it in dry summers from a modest trickle to, in the worst years, nothing at all. But those were not the measures the Drainage Board tracked. Those were not the numbers that appeared in anybody's annual report. Emmett Dykstra had been watching Deer Creek his whole life, and he had watched it get worse. He remembered when you could find creek chubs and smallmouth bass in the deep bends of it, when his father had let him wade it on summer afternoons, when the water ran clear enough after a rain to see the bottom within 2 days. He remembered when it ran all summer. By 2005, it was running dry by August most years. By 2010, it was running dry by mid-July. The tile outlets that drained his fields were dropping into a ditch that had no water in it, which meant the tiles were backing up, which meant the corners of his lowest fields were staying wet into June, which was costing him yield. He had mentioned this to the county extension office. He had mentioned it to the drainage district. He had been told that the drainage system was functioning as designed, and that any issues with low water in the creek in late summer were a function of precipitation patterns and were not within the county's jurisdiction to address. Let me tell you about the beavers, because they are the reason this story exists. The first beaver showed up on Emmett's stretch of Deer Creek in the fall of 2009. Emmett found the evidence before he found the animal. A stand of young willows along the bank, chewed down to pointed stumps, and a pile of sticks and mud blocking about a third of the channel just above the old concrete culvert where his lane crossed the creek. He stood there looking at it for a while. He was not a wildlife biologist. He was a farmer who had spent 60 years watching water move through this particular piece of ground, and what he thought, standing there looking at that half-built dam, was that it was going to raise the water level in the channel above it, and that raised water level was going to push water back into the old floodplain margins that the channelization had cut off, and that was going to mean wet ground in his lowest field. That was what he thought first. He thought about calling the county. He thought about pulling the dam out himself. He didn't do either of those things. He went home and ate supper and thought about it some more. What Emmett did instead, over the following weeks, was watch. He walked the creek every 2 or 3 days. He watched the dam get bigger. He watched the pool behind it deepen and widen. He watched, by November, a pond forming in the low area behind his fence line that had been dry ground since before he could remember, and he noticed something that he could not have explained to you in scientific language, but that he understood in the way that a man understands something he has watched for 60 years. The water that was filling that pond was not coming from rain. It was not coming from the tile outlets. It was coming up from the ground. The Beaver Dam had raised the water table in that corner of his property enough that the groundwater was expressing itself at the surface, filling the low spots, seeping into the old oxbow that the channelization had cut off and left to dry out decades before. He did not remove the dam. By 2011, there were 3 dams on his stretch of Deer Creek. The Beavers, he never knew how many, he rarely saw them, had been busy. The first pond had grown to nearly 2 acres. A second dam had formed 200 yards upstream, creating a shallower pond that spread into a stand of cottonwoods along the east bank. A third dam, the newest, sat just above his property line where the creek entered from the neighbor's ground to the north. The water table in his lowest field had risen enough that he had to plant it to a different hybrid, one with better wet-foot tolerance, but the field was producing again. The tile drainage in that corner was running clear water in August, which it had not done in years, because there was now enough water in the ground to feed it, and Deer Creek, on Emmett Stretch, was running. In August of 2011, when the creek above and below his property had gone to a trickle, the stretch through his land was running bank to bank. He had told his neighbor about it. His neighbor, Galen Sievert, who farmed the 300 acres to the north, had listened politely and then said he wasn't interested in having a bunch of rodents flooding his fields, and that if any of those dams backed water onto his ground, he'd be calling the county. Emmett said he understood. He went home. The citation arrived in July of 2012. A complaint had been filed. Emmett never learned by whom, though he had his suspicions, and a county drainage inspector named Phil Crowley had come out, walked the creek, photographed the dams, and issued the citation under Iowa's drainage district statutes, which gave the county the authority to require removal of any obstruction in a drainage improvement channel. The Beaver's dams were obstructions. The statute was clear. The citation was valid. Phil Crowley had been doing his job. Emmett paid the $430. He did not remove the dams. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When you imagine a man who refuses a government order on principle, you probably imagine someone loud about it, someone who calls a newspaper or shows up at the county board meeting with a folder full of documents or posts something on the internet. That was not Emmett Dykstra. Emmett was not a loud man. He had not been to a county board meeting in 11 years, and the last time he'd gone it was because the road commissioner had proposed closing the bridge on his road, and he needed it open to get his grain cart to the elevator. He was not a man who made speeches. He was a man who watched things and thought about them and made decisions quietly, and then did not change his mind. What he did, instead of removing the dams, was call a lawyer in Iowa City who handled agricultural and environmental cases, a woman named Margaret Albright, who had been recommended to him by a man at his church whose family had dealt with a drainage dispute 10 years earlier. He explained the situation to her. She listened for a long time without interrupting. Then she asked him several questions, including whether he had documentation of the creek conditions before and after the beavers arrived, and whether he had any records of his conversations with the county extension office and the drainage district. He said he had some notes and some photographs he had taken on his phone over the past 3 years, and a folder of letters he had written and the responses he had received. She said that was a start. Let me tell you about Margaret Albright, because she is part of this story, even though she is not the center of it. Margaret was 44 years old in 2012, and she had spent the previous 15 years doing a particular kind of legal work that most lawyers in Iowa City considered either admirable or quixotic, depending on their temperament. Representing rural landowners in disputes with drainage districts, county boards, and state agencies over water management. She had won some of those cases and lost others, and she had developed, over those 15 years, a very precise understanding of the gap between what Iowa's drainage statutes said and what Iowa's drainage statutes were designed to do, and how those two things had drifted apart, as the science of water management had evolved and the statutes had not. She had also developed a network of contacts at Iowa State University's Extension Service and at the Iowa Department of Natural Resources who were, in her words, quietly sympathetic to the idea that the state's approach to agricultural drainage was due for a serious rethinking. She told Emmett that she could not promise him anything. She told him the county's legal position was strong. She told him that the fines would accumulate while the case was being built and that he should be prepared for that. Emmett said he understood. He asked her what she needed from him. She said she needed him to keep taking photographs, keep writing down what he observed, and keep the dams intact. He said that was what he had been planning to do anyway. The fines began accumulating in September of 2012, $200 per week. Emmett wrote the checks and kept them in an envelope on his desk, but he did not send them. Margaret had advised him to hold them while she filed for an administrative review of the citation. The Drainage District's Board of Trustees met quarterly, and the review would be heard at the November meeting. Let me tell you about that November meeting, because it is where Phil Crowley said the thing that he would spend the next 3 years wishing he could take back. The meeting was held in the basement of the Tama County Courthouse on a Tuesday evening in November, in a room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs and a table at the front where the 5 trustees sat with their nameplates and their water glasses. There were perhaps 20 people in the room, a few farmers with drainage issues of their own, a reporter from the local paper who covered county government, and 2 men from the drainage district's engineering firm who had been asked to provide technical testimony. Emmett sat in the 3rd row with Margaret Albright beside him. Phil Crowley sat at the trustees' table because he was the district's inspector, and this was his citation being reviewed. Margaret presented Emmett's case methodically. She introduced his photographs. dated, geotagged images showing the creek conditions from 2009 through 2012. She introduced his written observations, which were not scientific documents but were specific and consistent and covered 3 years of creek behavior. She introduced the letters he had written to the Extension Office and the Drainage District and the responses he had received, which had consistently told him that the creek's declining summer flows were not the district's responsibility. She argued that the Beaver dams had demonstrably improved the hydrological function of the drainage channel, that the channel was moving more water, not less, that the groundwater recharge occurring on Emmett's property was directly reducing the drainage burden on the tile system, and that removing the dams would return the creek to conditions that were, by any reasonable measure, worse for the drainage district's stated purpose of managing agricultural water. She cited 2 studies from Iowa State and 1 from the University of Minnesota on the role of beaver activity in maintaining base flow in agricultural streams. Phil Crowley listened to all of this with his arms folded and his expression patient in the way that a man's expression is patient when he has already decided what he thinks. When Margaret finished, he leaned forward and said that what Mr. Dykstra had on his property was a drainage obstruction, that the statute was clear, and that the district did not have the authority to make exceptions based on what a landowner thought was good for the creek. He said that if they started letting every farmer decide which parts of the drainage code applied to him, they would have chaos. He said, and this was the part that the reporter wrote down and that appeared in the paper the following Thursday, that he had been inspecting drainage infrastructure in Tama County for 19 years, and he had never once seen a beaver dam improve a drainage situation, and he wasn't going to start believing it now because somebody brought in a folder of photographs and a couple of studies from a university. The trustees voted 3-2 to uphold the citation. Emmett would have 60 additional days to remove the dams, after which the weekly fines would resume, and the district would have the authority to remove the dams itself and bill Emmett for the cost. On the drive home, Margaret said she was going to appeal to the Iowa Drainage Court. Emmett said that was fine. She said the appeal would take time. He said he had time. She asked him if he was prepared to let this go as far as it needed to go. He looked out the window at the dark fields going by and said that he had watched that creek his whole life, and that what was in it now was the first living thing he had seen in it in 20 years, and that he was not going to pull it out. Let me tell you about the science, because Emmett did not have the language for it in 2012, but the science was on his side in ways that even he did not fully understand. The problem with channelized agricultural streams, and Deer Creek was a nearly perfect example of the type, is that they are extraordinarily efficient at doing one thing and catastrophically bad at doing everything else. A channelized stream moves water fast. It drains fields quickly after rain events, which is what it was designed to do. What it also does is disconnect the stream from its floodplain, which eliminates the shallow groundwater recharge that happens when a stream overtops its banks and spreads across low ground. It increases the velocity of water in the channel, which accelerates streambed erosion and deepens the channel further over time, which lowers the water table in the surrounding land, which dries out the floodplain further, which reduces the biological activity in the riparian zone, which reduces the stream's ability to filter nutrients and sediment from the agricultural runoff draining into it. Each of these effects reinforces the others. A channelized stream is a system in a slow death spiral, and the death spiral is invisible in the short term, because the one thing the stream does well, move water quickly, is the only thing anyone is measuring. Beaver dams interrupt this spiral at every stage. A beaver dam raises the water surface elevation in the channel, which slows water velocity, which reduces erosion. The raised water surface pushes water back into the floodplain, which recharges the shallow groundwater, which raises the water table in the surrounding land. The ponds behind the dams trap sediment and nutrients that would otherwise move downstream. The wetland vegetation that establishes in the ponded areas provides habitat, filters runoff, and builds organic matter in the soil. And because the groundwater table is higher, the stream has a source of base flow, water moving slowly through the ground and expressing into the channel, that keeps it running in dry periods when surface runoff has stopped. A stream with good groundwater connection runs in August. A channelized stream does not. The researchers who had documented this were not obscure. Dr. Carol Reinhardt at Iowa State had published work in 2008 on beaver activity in agricultural watersheds in central Iowa that showed, across 6 study sites, that streams with active beaver complexes maintained summer base flows 2 to 4 times higher than comparable channelized streams in the same watershed. A University of Minnesota study from 2010 had documented groundwater table elevation increases of up to 3 feet within 200 meters of beaver ponds in agricultural landscapes. The Iowa DNR's own non-point source pollution assessment from 2011 had identified beaver-created wetlands as among the most cost-effective nutrient retention features in agricultural watersheds, at a cost to the public of exactly $0 because the beavers built them for free. None of this had reached Phil Crowley. None of it had reached the Tama County Drainage District's Board of Trustees. It was sitting in journals and extension publications and agency reports, and it was entirely invisible to the people making decisions about Deer Creek, because the people making decisions about Deer Creek were operating under a framework built in 1964 that had one variable: move the water off the fields. Everything else was someone else's problem. The appeal to Iowa Drainage Court was filed in January of 2013. The case was assigned to a judge in Iowa City who had a reputation for reading the briefs carefully. Margaret submitted a 40-page brief that included the Iowa State study, the Minnesota study, the DNR report, and a hydrological analysis of Deer Creek commissioned from a consulting firm in Ames that had sent a technician out to Emmett's property in October to measure water levels, flow rates, and groundwater depth at a series of monitoring points. The analysis cost $3,200, which Emmett paid out of his operating account without complaint. The Drainage District's response brief was 22 pages and relied primarily on the statutory language. The statute said obstructions must be removed. Beaver dams were obstructions. The district had the authority to require removal. The science was interesting but not legally relevant to the district's statutory mandate. The judge took 4 months to issue his ruling. Let me tell you about the summer of 2013, because it was the summer that the rest of Tama County began to notice what was happening on Emmett's stretch of Deer Creek, and not because of the lawsuit. The summer of 2013 was dry. Not catastrophically dry, not 2012, which had been the worst drought in a generation across the Midwest, but dry enough, persistently dry enough through June and July that the creeks in Tama County were dropping fast. By the first week of August, the Iowa River at the Tama gauge was running at 30% of its normal late summer flow. The tributaries were worse. Otter Creek, which drained the northwestern part of the county, was a series of disconnected pools by mid-July. Deer Creek, above and below Emmett's property, was a narrow thread of water moving over exposed gravel. On Emmett's stretch, the creek was running bank to bank. This was not invisible. County Road E41 crossed Deer Creek twice within a mile of Emmett's property, and farmers who drove that road every day could see the difference. Above the first crossing, heading north, the creek was low and clear and narrow. Below the second crossing, heading south, same thing. Between those two crossings, on the stretch that ran through Emmett's ground, the creek was full. The beaver ponds were holding water that had accumulated through the wet months and was releasing slowly through the dams, maintaining the flow downstream. The groundwater that had been recharged over 3 years of high water tables was moving through the soil and expressing into the channel at a rate that kept the stream bed wet even when no rain had fallen in 3 weeks. Galen Sievert, Emmett's neighbor to the north, drove past the creek on the morning of August 9th and stopped his truck on the bridge and got out and stood there looking at it for a while. He had been one of the people Emmett suspected, though he never confirmed it, who had filed the original complaint with the drainage district. He stood on that bridge for several minutes. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. The judge's ruling came down in August of 2013. It was a partial victory. The judge found that the drainage district had the statutory authority to require removal of obstructions in improvement channels, and that this authority was not superseded by the ecological benefits documented in Emmett's expert evidence. However, the judge also found that the district was required, under Iowa's Administrative Procedures Act, to conduct an environmental review before taking any action that would result in the removal of a wetland feature, and that the district had not conducted such a review. The judge stayed the enforcement of the citation pending completion of that review and ordered the district to engage with the Iowa DNR in the review process. Phil Crowley, when he read the ruling, reportedly said some things that are not appropriate to repeat here. The environmental review took 14 months. The Iowa DNR assigned a wetland specialist to the case, a young woman named Dr. Iris Johansson, who had done her graduate work on prairie pothole restoration and who drove out to Emmett's property on a cold morning in October of 2013 to walk the creek and look at the dams and take her own measurements. She spent 4 hours on the property. She took water samples. She measured the pond areas with a GPS unit. She dug soil pits in the floodplain margins and described the hydric soil indicators she found there. The gray-mottled layers, the iron-manganese concentrations, the organic matter accumulation, that told her this ground had been wetland within living memory, and that the beaver activity had begun to restore its wetland hydrology. She was professional and thorough, and said very little to Emmett while she worked. But when she was done, and they were standing by her truck, she looked at him and said, "You've got something real here." He said he knew. Dr. Johansson's report, submitted to the Drainage District and the court in December of 2014, was 58 pages long and concluded that the beaver complex on Emmett's stretch of Deer Creek constituted a jurisdictional wetland under both federal and state definitions. That removal of the dams would result in the loss of approximately 4.3 acres of wetland, and that this loss would trigger review requirements under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act and Iowa's Wetland Mitigation Banking Program. Removing the dams, in other words, would require the drainage district to either mitigate the wetland loss at a ratio of 1.5 to 1, meaning they would have to create or restore 6.45 acres of wetland elsewhere in the watershed, or obtain a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, a process that typically took 18 to 24 months and cost tens of thousands of dollars in engineering and legal fees. The Drainage District's Board of Trustees met in January of 2015 to discuss the report. The meeting was not open to the public in the sense that anyone had advertised it, but Emmett was notified because he was a party to the proceeding, and he sat in the same basement room with the same fluorescent lights and listened as the district's attorney explained the situation. The attorney said that pursuing enforcement of the citation was no longer advisable from a cost-benefit standpoint. The attorney said the district was looking at potential Corps of Engineers permitting costs in excess of $40,000, plus the cost of wetland mitigation, plus the ongoing legal costs of the proceeding, to remove 4 beaver dams that were, by the DNR's own assessment, providing measurable water quality and hydrological benefits to the watershed. The attorney recommended that the board dismiss the citation and enter into a management agreement with Mr. Dykstra that would allow the beaver complex to remain in place under a monitoring protocol. Phil Crowley was at that meeting. He sat at the trustees' table with his arms folded, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "So, we're going to tell him he was right." The district's attorney said that was one way to characterize it. Phil Crowley looked at the table. Then he said, "Fine." The board voted 4-1 to dismiss the citation. The dissenting vote was Phil Crowley's. Now, let me tell you about the summer of 2015, because that is when the story stopped being about a lawsuit and started being about water. The summer of 2015 was the second dry summer in 3 years in Tama County. July was hot and rainless for 22 consecutive days. The Iowa River dropped to levels not recorded since 2012. The creeks dried up again. Otter Creek, Richland Creek, the upper reaches of Deer Creek above Emmett's property. Farmers with livestock were hauling water. A few operations had to truck cattle to other pastures because their ponds had gone dry. The county extension office issued an advisory about water management for livestock operations. On Emmett's stretch of Deer Creek, the creek was running. The beaver ponds, now in their 6th year, held enough water that the groundwater table in his lower fields was still high enough to feed the tile outlets, which were feeding the creek, which was running. Not fast, not high, but running. There was water in it every day of that July. Galen Sievert's pond went dry on July 14th. He had 43 cow-calf pairs that needed water. He had a well, but his well pump was not designed to supply that volume, and running it continuously for weeks would burn out the motor. He drove down County Road E41 on the morning of July 15 and turned into Emmett's Lane and drove up to the house and knocked on the door. Emmett answered. He had been expecting this visit for about 2 years. Galen stood on the porch and said he was in a situation. Emmett said he knew. Galen said his pond was dry and he needed water for his cattle, and he was wondering if Emmett had any suggestions. Emmett looked at him for a moment and then said, "You want to run a pipe from the creek?" Galen said that would help. Emmett said he could do that. He said the creek was running about 4 inches of water over the gravel below the 3rd dam, which wasn't much, but it was enough to gravity feed a float-controlled tank in Galen's pasture if they ran a 2-inch line under the fence. Galen said that would work. He said he appreciated it. Emmett said, "I told you this creek would run in July." Galen looked at his boots. He said, "You did?" Emmett said, "Phil Crowley told me I was wrong." Galen said, "Phil Crowley's pond is dry too." They ran the pipe that afternoon. Galen's cattle had water through the rest of July and into August. He did not pay Emmett for it. Emmett did not ask him to. Let me tell you about what happened in the years after, because this story does not end with a pipe under a fence. The Iowa DNR's wetland specialist, Dr. Iris Johansson, published a paper in 2016 in the Journal of the American Water Resources Association that used Emmett's property as one of 3 case studies in a study of beaver-mediated stream restoration in agricultural watersheds in the upper Midwest. The paper documented the hydrological changes on Emmett's stretch of Deer Creek from 2009 through 2015. The groundwater table elevation increases, the base flow maintenance during drought periods, the nutrient retention in the beaver ponds, and the reduction in streambed erosion below the dam complex. The paper concluded that the beaver complex had provided hydrological services equivalent to those that would have been provided by a constructed wetland, costing an estimated $220,000 to build and $40,000 per year to maintain, at a cost to the public of $0. The paper was not widely read outside of academic and agency circles, but it was read by a Soil and Water Conservation District coordinator in Story County named Aaron Gustafson, who had been looking for low-cost approaches to agricultural watershed restoration and who drove down to Tama County in the spring of 2016 to walk Emmett's Creek with him and talk about what he had seen. He was 32 years old and had a master's degree in watershed science from Iowa State, and he stood on the bank of the first beaver pond and looked at the cattails and the sedge and the wood ducks sitting on the water and said, "How long did this take?" Emmett said, "About 6 years from the first dam." Aaron said, "And you just let 'em do it?" Emmett said, "I just didn't stop them." Aaron Gustafson went back to Story County and wrote a grant proposal to the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service for funding to develop a protocol for managing beaver activity in agricultural drainage channels as a low-cost watershed restoration tool. The grant was funded in 2017 at $240,000 over 3 years. The protocol development work used Emmett's property as the primary reference site. Emmett did not receive any of the grant money. He did not ask for any. By 2017, word had spread through the county in the way that word spreads in a place where everyone knows everyone's land. 3 other farmers in Tama County had reported beaver activity on their properties, and, instead of calling the drainage district, had called Emmett. He had talked to all of them. He had told them what he had observed. He had told them to be patient, to watch the water, to document what they saw. He had told them that the county might come after them and that they should call Margaret Albright if they did. 2 of them had let the beavers stay. 1 had removed the dam. The one who removed it called Emmett the following August when his creek went dry and said he wished he hadn't. Phil Crowley retired from the drainage district in the spring of 2017. There was a small retirement party at the courthouse. Emmett was not invited and did not attend. He heard about it from a man at his church who said Phil had given a short speech and had not mentioned the Dykstra case, which was the case that everyone in the room was thinking about. Let me tell you about the meeting that happened in October of 2017, because it is the one that Emmett talks about when he talks about this at all. The Tama County Soil and Water Conservation District hosted a field day at Emmett's property on an October afternoon. The kind of field day where farmers and agency people walk around a property together and look at things and talk about them. There were about 30 people there. Aaron Gustafson was there. Dr. Johansson was there. Several farmers from Tama and adjacent counties were there. A man from the NRCS state office in Des Moines was there. A woman from the Iowa DNR's Watershed Bureau was there. Phil Crowley was there. Emmett did not know Phil was coming. He saw him arrive in his personal truck, not the county white pickup, he was retired now, and park at the end of the lane and walk up to join the group. They had not spoken since the January 2015 board meeting. Emmett watched him come and then looked away and kept talking to the farmer next to him. The group walked the creek. Aaron Gustafson led the technical discussion, explaining the hydrology, pointing out the monitoring wells that had been installed as part of the NRCS study, showing the water level data on his tablet. The beaver ponds were full. The creek was running. It was October, which was not remarkable. The creek usually ran in October. But Aaron showed them the data from the previous August, the dry August, and the data showed that Emmett's stretch had maintained a measurable base flow throughout the month while the reaches above and below had run dry. He showed them the groundwater data, the nutrient retention numbers, the soil organic matter measurements from the floodplain margins. He talked about what it would cost to replicate these services with constructed infrastructure. He talked about what the beavers had cost. At the end of the walk, the group gathered near the first pond. The afternoon light was low and gold across the water, and there were two great blue herons standing in the shallows at the far end, and the cattails were going to seed in the October wind. Someone asked Emmett what he would say to a farmer who was thinking about letting beavers stay on their creek. He thought about it for a moment. He said, "I'd say watch the water. Watch where it goes when it rains, and watch where it goes when it doesn't. The beavers aren't doing anything the creek doesn't want to do. They're just giving it permission." He looked out at the pond. He said, "The county told me I had 60 days to remove those dams. That was 5 years ago. The creek's been running every August since. Make of that what you will." Phil Crowley was standing at the edge of the group. He was looking at the water. He did not say anything. After the group dispersed, when most of the trucks had pulled out of the lane and the October light was getting thin, Phil Crowley walked over to where Emmett was standing by the fence. They stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then Phil said, "I was wrong about this." Emmett looked at him. Phil said, "I want you to know that I know that." Emmett said, "I know you know it." Phil said, "I was doing my job." Emmett said, "I know that too." Phil looked at the water for a while. He said, "Does it run all summer now?" Emmett said, "Every summer since 2011. Phil nodded. He said, "That's something." He put his hands in his pockets and walked back to his truck. Emmett stood by the fence until the truck was gone. Then he walked down to the bank of the first pond and stood there in the last of the October light, listening to the water moving over the dam. Let me tell you about what the creek looks like now, because the story does not end with two men standing by a fence. Emmett Dykstra is 73 years old. He still farms 380 acres in Tama County, Iowa, and Deer Creek still runs through the southeast corner of his land. There are now 6 beaver dams on his stretch of the creek, the 2 original dams having been added to over the years as the colony expanded. The pond complex covers approximately 7 acres. The floodplain margins on both sides of the channel support a dense stand of sedge and willow and buttonbush that was not there in 2009. The stream bed, which was eroding actively when the beavers arrived, has stabilized. The channel above the first dam has filled in somewhat. The silt that used to blow past in every rain event has been settling in the ponds for 14 years, building the stream bed back up. In some stretches, the creek is running at an elevation 2 feet higher than it was in 2009, which means the water table in the adjacent fields is 2 feet higher, which means those fields hold moisture longer into a dry summer. Emmett's lowest field, the